seamless segue from the fracking into the TTIP and COP21 stuff. And the seamless bit's going to come a little bit later in. But I'm hoping that... I'm John Hilary, by the way. I'm the Director of War on Want. And I'm hoping that people, by and large in this room, already know a bit about TTIP. So I'm not exactly going to start at the beginning. Do you want to put your hand up if you do know about TTIP a bit? Yeah, pretty good. So what I'm going to, I mean, as you know, basically up until now people have focused particularly on the impact of TTIP on the NHS, TTIP on food, TTIP on jobs. 1 million jobs is the official estimate of what are going to be lost under TTIP. But there's been less emphasis perhaps, particularly on the left, on the impact that TTIP is going to have in terms of climate, in terms of the environment, in terms of fracking, and more generally. And so what I thought I'd do in my little 10 minutes here is to address 4 of those areas, which brings in why there is a really strong left and green alliance to fight TTIP, and why it's helping us broaden an understanding amongst completely new audiences of what the threats of this ever-expanding program of neoliberal capitalism is about. The first sort of key reason, I suppose, why TTIP is going to be catastrophic for any form of climate justice or action to try and stop climate change is that it is based on the premise of endless growth and expansion. The whole point of TTIP is to push for more trade, more growth, more expansion as capital needs if it's going to survive. And so for them, they've said on every scenario, this is the European Commission's own language, under every single possible scenario that will come out of the TTIP talks, we will see dramatic growth, millions of tons of extra CO2 into the atmosphere, and a profound danger to biodiversity. That's their words, not ours. And the reason for this is because if you can imagine how trade exists under the skewed logic of a globalized capitalist system, it is that just more trade in anything has got to be a good thing. So Britain, for example, at the moment, we export 100,000 tons of pork every year. And we import 100,000 tons of pork every year. So the ships are basically passing each other in mid-ocean, spewing out all of the CO2, doing absolutely nothing for food miles, and you would think to yourself, that's crazy. But of course, under the logic which they're promoting, it's absolutely brilliant, because it just means more money and everything being churned around in a senseless exchange rather than anything which would be useful. So more growth, more trade without ever thinking why is absolutely the premise, and that's why they say TTIP is going to be bad for the environment, but hell, we'll go ahead with it anyway. The second reason, and this goes to the centre of what TTIP's all about, is the pillar of deregulation on which TTIP is really based. Deregulation so that capital is no longer embedded within the social and the environmental demands of society, but it's free. It's freed up from any of those conditions. And here you're looking at the environmental regulations which have been brought in at the European level, like, for example, the Fuel Quality Directive. Absolutely anathema to the US, obviously even more now to VW, since it's been found cheating. But that just gives you a nice example, really, where if you think that capital can regulate itself, just look at the extraordinary lengths they'll go to avoid any sensible regulation. So the deregulation agenda is already beginning to undermine some of the key directives at the European level which have been fought for years. And as I say, the Fuel Quality Directive is the one which everybody is focused on. And that will also come up in a second, where you find out some of the other bits of TTIP. So firstly, just an increase in growth of CO2 emissions as a result of TTIP. Secondly, an undermining of the climate justice, the climate change preventing directives and regulations at the European level. The third, and this is the seamless connection to what Steve was saying about fracking. The other bit, which I'm sure you know about, which has been most controversial under TTIP, is the introduction of this investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, where corporations get a unique power to be able to sue governments for any new policy which is brought in which might disturb their profits in the future. And here, in particular, it's exactly the sort of bans on fracking that we've seen so from France, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, Scotland, almost in Wales, You know, these are the things which have already been targeted. So in Canada, where they already have the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism with the US under NAFTA, the province of Quebec put a moratorium on fracking under the St. Lawrence River. Immediately, it's now being challenged for $250 million by a US company called Lone Pine, which is suing them because it's saying, we had plans. We had plans to frack under the St. Lawrence River, and under free trade, you don't get to choose whether or not you close down that market or not. Actually, the ultimate irony is Lone Pine isn't even a US company. It's a Canadian company with an office in the US, so it'd be able to sue its own government in a way it couldn't do under its own national courts, simply because it's managed to use the ISDS mechanism within NAFTA. And of course, at the beginning of the TTIP negotiations back in 2013, the UK government asked the London School of Economics to do a study. What are going to be the impacts, what are going to be the consequences of introducing these new powers for corporations in TTIP? And they came back saying, let's be absolutely clear, there will be no benefits. This is the LSE talking, there will be no benefits at all. US companies are not waiting to invest into Europe as a result of this, but there will be dramatic costs. And the costs that they said there would be what Canada's facing and even more. So you can bet your bottom dollar that fracking is going to be one of the key areas of contention, and any bans or moratoria which have been brought in will immediately be challenged by US corporations who are keen to start drilling, irrespective of whether there's any public opposition. Of course, again, is another ground on which they can sue. I mean, you couldn't really make it up. There's been places where there have been resistance in Central American countries to US corporations coming in, and they've been sued because of public protests locally preventing them from being able to do their job. So unless you get a strong enough paramilitary force to stop people protesting in their own communities, then you're guilty. So my fourth, and perhaps the most important of all of these areas, is that in TTIP, one of the key provisions that they want to put in, and the European Union wants to have this really big and writ large as its separate chapter, is an energy chapter. And the energy chapter is about freeing up the export from the US of shale gas, from the massive boom and fracking that they've got over in the US, and from tar sands oil, which comes down from Alberta, from Canada, and is refined in the US and then gets shipped across to the European Union. At the moment, this doesn't happen. There are some fairly strict rules under which you can and can't export natural resources from the US. But once you have a free trade deal in place, like TTIP, that opens the tap. And the idea is, from the European Union, that you open the tap through TTIP to get this massive flood of oil and gas, and not just any oil, tar sands oil, as we know, being the dirtiest, the most carbon intensive, the most polluting. You get them streaming across the Atlantic. And this is particularly catastrophic for climate change because there are not any facilities at the moment, like the ports and the pipelines, which make that type of export possible from the US to Europe. So they're going to have to invest tens of billions of dollars into creating the infrastructure to allow that trade to happen. And that means, of course, you're locked in for decades, because you make that investment, you want your money back. And so they're going to make sure that we are locked into dependency on that oil and gas to the next generation and beyond. And that is really what brings you to why they're doing this. The key thing, and it fits with this, the theme of today, the key thing about TTIP is not just the extra powers to capital. It's also about the imperialist pushback against Russia. And at the moment, if you think that many of the countries of Europe are dependent upon Russian gas and oil to a huge degree, much more than we are in Britain, they have said explicitly, TTIP is about opening that new surge in fossil fuels from the Atlantic so that we can break the dependence upon Russian gas and oil for many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And they're therefore calling TTIP, their words, not ours, the economic NATO. TTIP becomes the economic way of isolating Russia in the same way as all of the troop movements that are currently going on through the eastern side of Poland. NATO troops going through the east of Poland into the villages, being welcomed in many instances. TTIP is the economic arm of that. Finally then, was that 2 minutes or was that saying that?
That's 2 minutes.
Oh, that's good. I've got ages. Not finally. The next thing, where do we take it? I mean, one of the big things for us at the moment is using TTIP as a mechanism to be able to broaden a public political consciousness around what actually these things mean, both in terms of the capitalist expansion and in terms of the imperialist threat. And so that's why we've got at the moment a 2-week campaign going on in the Lush shops. I don't know if you know Lush Cosmetics, if you have them local to you. In 276 Lush shops across Europe in this fortnight, we've got a big TTIP campaign going on. People going in, getting these nice sort of free papers to give away, which is being guest edited by Vivienne Westwood. It's got lots of stuff in from us. It's trying to reach out to new audiences and saying, if you have any interest in preserving the climate in the future, you have got to be aware of these threats. But the other thing we're trying to do is make people aware that there happens to be a referendum on the membership of the EU coming up. And for us, you can't begin to address any of these issues until you start thinking about the political logjam of being stuck within the institutions of the EU. We are proud to be internationalist, proud to be European, but absolutely frustrated beyond belief by over 20 years, in my case, banging our heads against the walls of the European Union and seeing not the slightest change. And not just no change, but no possibility of change. There are no democratic levers at all within the European Union. And that, I think, is a profound challenge to those on the centre-left who in the past have always thought that, yes, we lose a bit of sovereignty by being part of the European Union, but at least we get back stronger social and environmental rights than we would have if we were on our own. Well, I think now, TTIP, the internal competitiveness agenda, all of the fiscal stability pacts, they are telling everybody it's a lose-lose. You lose sovereignty, you lose democracy, and increasingly you're losing out on any possibility of holding to the model of social Europe. So, 5th of October, everything in October's in Manchester. The 4th is the demo, as you know. The 5th, we're having a day of actions on TTIP. We're hoping still to get permission to do the action at the council in front of the town hall in Albert Square at lunchtime. But then at 5:30 in the afternoon, as a curtain raiser for the Jeremy Corbyn show later, at 5:30 on Monday the 5th of October, come and hear Owen Jones, Birgitta Jonsdottir, who's the Icelandic MP who led the big resistance and tried actually to get some sort of a different future for the Icelandic people, John Rees from the People's Assembly, and a whole lot of others, including people from Friends of the Earth, trying to make that link, asking the question, okay, we're fighting against TTIP, surely we should be fighting against European Union institutions at the same time. So I'm hoping to see you all there. The 4th is like a warm-up, and the 5th is the real day. You should be in Manchester. Thank you.